I me mine, I me mine. Even those tears, I me mine, I me mine, I me mine. Now they're frightened of playing it, everyone saying it, flowing more freely than wine. All through the day, I me mine. George Harrison of the Beatles poignantly points to the dangers and deceptions of personal and possessive pronouns. I, me, mine. Pentecost 18a, Matthew 21, verses 33 to 46. Whose vineyard is it? By misunderstanding personal pronouns, we begin to believe and act as if the world around us is our personal possession. My ideas, my religion, my possessions, my people, my spouse, my children, my territory, myself. Jesus tells a story that connects on different levels concerning whose vineyard it really is. Whose vineyard is it? Well, God's, of course. Forgetting that courts disaster. The vineyard in the parable does not belong to its stewards, its trustees. If the tenants, the trustees, become proprietary about this vineyard, they will have failed in their stewardship. Sometimes we reject our status as beloved and valued trustees of God's world. We begin to think of ourselves as outright owners, and in so doing, position ourselves equal to God. The authorities who face Jesus and hear this story assume that judgment is an event that is way off in the foreseeable future, and not an incentive toward accountability today. When it finally comes, they're going to assume that the Messiah will finally set all things right. All the things that they perceive as unfair and unjust and unavenged will be fixed. The Messiah will intervene, punch all the bad guys in the nose, and by executive order command utopia to happen. Because this is not Jesus' platform, he's automatically aggravating the authorities into getting rid of him. They weren't expecting Jesus. They didn't see him coming. After all, he was born in a barn. God sent many messengers. They weren't recognized. The prior presumption of who owned the world and who was in charge got in the way of faithful stewardship. God sent Isaiah naked and barefoot for 3 years as a warning of judgment in Isaiah 19 and 20. He's the first recorded streaker. How strange. God sent Martin Luther, who was at times gruff and bilious, and at other times deeply thoughtful and comedic. Still, often not appreciated as a new steward of God's world. God doesn't give up on us, even when we reject his servants. The allegorical point of Jesus' parable stresses this. Galilee in the first century felt much resentment against absentee ownership. And this incident most certainly played out very often in real life. Except for one critical difference. No landowner would be dumb enough to send 3 consecutive delegations, including his son, only to be beaten and killed by unfaithful stewards. Any normal landlord, after the failure of the first servant to return in one piece, would send his militia, get his vineyard back, and use the faithless tenants for fertilizer. How nice. God doesn't work this way. He has this marvelous history of keeping on trying with us, even though we block his efforts. He sends continual messengers, and our job is to recognize them, to take to heart their message, no matter how weird they may seem. It is his vineyard. The rulers of the Jews made the error so common in administrators of states and churches and families of admiring too much their own authority and system and losing touch with the great living source of all authority, whose vineyard it is. That is how you hear this parable as a privileged political administrator. And now, here's how you hear it as a peasant, with fond hopes for resolution and freedom from Roman rule. Shift gears. The only absentee owners of this time in Israel were Roman senators, who foreclosed on and bought up ranch-style acreages of land for pennies. It was the latifundia plantation system of agriculture. They stripped out the grain crops, planted vineyards and orchards instead. Jesus is describing a huge estate. If it requires its own wine press and its own watchtower, the mistake that's going to cost the landowner is that he hires back onto this land the people he stole the land from in the first place, who now work it as slaves. Now, they're working harder, not seeing any profit, and they and their families are hungry. There aren't any unions, and the owner doesn't care about anything other than the profit from the grapes. He lives 400 miles away, 40 days travel, and he owns other slaves to do his collections. The tenants, wage slaves, assault and kill the landowner's representatives. And good for them. They're now successful revolutionaries, redeeming their own land. The owner can't make the trips, so he sends a second wave of representatives to collect. They're also assaulted and killed by the tenants. Yippee! We're winning! Now the tide is turning our way in the revolution. So the landowner sends his son. Clearly, this dumb Roman senator does not understand the depths of antipathy and hatred toward him. He might be a nice guy. He might pay his stewards actually pretty well. But the point is getting the occupied land back. Whose vineyard is it? The tenants aren't counting on being in a will if the landowner were to die. They're counting on taking their own land back from the hated master by killing his son, and to be heroes for doing it. Jesus says, what happens next? You finish the story for me now, please. Well, the senator landowner, at the public expense of taxation, will hire a fighting force to come back and take the disputed land, and we'll be paying the Romans our good tax money to come back and kill us and steal our land another time. Jesus is right, and more people will be hired as tenants. This time they'll work for less, and they'll comply with this fresh negative example of rebellion squashed right there in the front of their minds. The subtext, the meta message to the Jewish religious authorities becomes, what right have you to incite rebellion to poor innocent folks who've already lost everything? They're dying. You're prospering in your collaboration with the enemy Rome. If you don't produce taxes, the Romans will crush you too. You're thinking politics, leverage. They're thinking power and expedience. You're naive cultural moralists, a small snack in the voracious mouth of an amoral legion. Why the anti-Rome rhetoric on the home front and the pro-Rome behavior when the senators are in town? And how are you any better than the Romans in your shabby administration of God's vineyard? Problem is, we act like owners, but we're just tenants. We're stewards of God's abundance. We forget whose vineyard it is. God gives us control of this vast estate, including our very own, very personal selves. But it all belongs to God, we know that. His name is on the deed of creation. He provides abundantly and only asks for a small portion. to recognize his ownership. Everything's always in a state of transformation. All of creation circulates. Sometimes it lands in our lap for us to enjoy momentarily, to take care of, and then get it recirculating again. We own nothing forever. We're free to use and enjoy everything as long as we have God's breath in us. This is good news even in bad times. How tragic that Jesus is rejected for pointing out that God's in charge and that it's his vineyard. The message is mutually offensive to the politicians, the priests, and the people. Golgotha, the side of the crucifixion, looked like a skull because it was a rejected quarry. The limestone was too soft. The place of the skull and the cross became the cornerstone for hope and salvation. Cornerstone serves double duty. It's strong and sound enough to serve as a binder between two walls. Christ as cornerstone joins walls. The walls of Judaism and Christianity. The walls of sacred and secular. The walls of Rome and Jerusalem. The walls, all of which protect God's vineyard. What we build, thinking that it is our vineyard only, without Christ a cornerstone, will buckle under the strain of poverty, injustice, and war. What we as a world community built in the First World War to make the world safe for democracy succeeded in 2 decades in making it tolerably safe for dictatorship. It is risky to forget whose vineyard it all really is. On a personal level, when we build relationships, if Christ is our cornerstone, the relationships will be everlasting. We are servants, stewards and sturdy because of the stone. We stand solid, working and enjoying God's vineyard. Amen.